All right, I'm going to kick us off. Okay, it is 6:03 my time. I am in Spain. So I relocated from the US in January of this year. So I'm excited that you all are here. We still have some people joining, which is amazing, but I want to kick us off so we can start talking about resume writing in 2025. So I just want to start by saying that the landscape has changed a lot, drastically, especially in the last, I would say, 3 years. We have seen a big shift in the job market, how companies are hiring. We're seeing shifts in the economy. We're seeing AI technology come into play. So there's a lot of variables right now that is really creating a space where, quite frankly, people are having challenges when it comes to navigating the current job market. And one of those areas being in resume writing, because that is the first step in order to typically for you to land interviews, unless say you're networking your way in. So we're going to cover essentially some guidelines when it comes to resume writing. I want to just take a second to introduce myself because some people don't know me, some of you do. So why I'm even talking about this topic, and I want to make sure you understand kind of where my credentials come from. So I am a recruiter previously. I used to work at both Google and Indeed in recruiting. So I have a really strong pulse on hiring. I've worked with different hiring managers. I've worked across different role profiles. I've worked across different regions. So the US, Canada, parts of Europe, Asia. So I really have a strong pulse on hiring concepts, and I have a lot of friends that are still in recruiting. I did that for a while, and then now currently I am a career coach, but I also advise for Glassdoor as well. So you probably will see me post on Glassdoor and some of their bowls that they have. So they have career advice bowls. And then I also now work with companies to help educate companies on best hiring practices, and then also for employee development as well. So that's where my credentials come in. I am certified as a professional resume writer. So I have a CPRW, which is why I'm here having this conversation with all of you. And really my goal is to make sure that I am giving you as much information as I can. And my hope is that this will help you be able to take some feedback and use that to work on your own resume, because this is one of the pain points that I hear for a lot of people is, how do I write a resume that really resonates with employers in today's job market? How do I get past the applicant tracking system? Because a lot of companies now are using AI, artificial intelligence, to screen job applications, to screen resumes before it even gets into the hands of a recruiter or a hiring manager. So those are going to be some of the things that we're talking about here today. So what we'll cover is the 6-second rule, job description check. We're going to go through ATS. I get a lot of questions there around like, how does the applicant tracking system actually work? And how can I make sure that my resume is ATS friendly, or that it meets the criteria for the applicant tracking system? So again, I can actually get in front of somebody to review my resume. We'll talk about a few myths versus reality. Before you write, there's a couple of things that I typically do in terms of guiding people on best practices for sitting down and doing a bit of reflection before they actually go and write their own resumes. Then we're going to talk about the strong framework for building out your resume. We'll go into my specific framework that I typically train people on, which is the SSIP framework. So scope, scale, impact, proposition. We'll talk about quantifying achievements. We'll wrap it up with final guides and best practices. And then I do want to answer the questions that you all have. Does that sound good for everyone? Hopefully it does, because that's what I'm covering. But okay, perfect. Thank you. So let's go ahead and jump in. Stephanie, do you have a question?
No, I was trying to do a thumbs up.
Oh, okay. No, all good. No, all good. All good. Shinta, do you have a question?
No, same here.
You're all good. No worries. We're going to go ahead and jump in then. So let's go to the next slide here. So essentially, let's start and talk about the 6-second rule. The 6-second rule, this is something you may or may not have heard about before, but this is a real concept. So in the world of recruiting, and I can tell you this, again, having been in the shoes of recruiting myself and having looked at thousands of resumes, this is real. Essentially, recruiters are typically hiring for multiple roles at a given time. Because they're hiring for multiple roles at a given time, And within each of those roles, yes, the session will be available, the recording will be. And because they are hiring for multiple roles at a time and there's a lot of applicants coming through on each of the job roles that they're working on, which they call requisitions, what you find is that a lot of times recruiters initially, they are going to skim resumes. So they typically, and this is a statistic, and the latest one I saw was 6.7 seconds that they will spend initially looking at your resume, doing a quick kind of glance through before they decide if they're going to do a double take and do a click down and actually spend time really reviewing your resume. And I share that because this really just goes to show you that how you structure and format your resume, the content that you have in there is really important. And so it's really important just to understand what that means in today's job market. And again, because so much has shifted, even just in the past 3 years, things are continuously changing, but there are some guidelines and standard best practices that you can implement to help you stand out against others that are in the job market. So 6.7 seconds is the average timeline you're going to see a recruiter doing a quick glance. And so we want to capture their attention. So we're going to talk about how we can do that. Now, going into job description. So one thing that I want to call out before we get into the resume writing portion is that as you are looking at job descriptions, the one downfall I will say when it comes to job descriptions is that there's a lot of information sometimes that can be fluff. It can just feel like, I don't know what I actually need to be paying attention to because either there's so much information or there's not enough information and it's very sparse to where you're just like, well, I guess I'm going to apply because, you know, they have like 2 bullet points and I don't actually know what they're really hiring for, but I think I can do the role based on the title. So when you look at job descriptions, what I do tell people is important, especially for the ones where there is more content, where you can actually maybe get a feel for what they might be hiring for, to spend some time in the job description outside of just the minimum qualifications, because what you will find is that the minimum qualifications is just one portion of how they're making the hiring decision. And a lot of times people will say, well, I meet the minimum qualifications. I don't understand why I didn't get the interview. It's because there's layers to a job description. So I typically will recommend to people to spend some time and actually review the job description from top down. And I'm actually going to be doing a workshop on this as well, like decoding job descriptions. But just for the sake of this session here, spend some time just from the top down, because typically what you'll find is that in the actual responsibilities, and sometimes there's the paragraph that's right under the initial one where they talk about the company and, you know, the whole, hey, we're hiring for this, blah, blah, blah. There's typically going to say something about, well, this role is going to report into this person, or this role is going to support this person or this team. So pay attention to kind of some of those cues. Pay attention to some of the words that you keep seeing coming up in the job description. So some of those skills, which are also known as key words. So if you're seeing cross collaboration come up 5 different times, well, that to me is a signal that you should probably somewhere in your resume be talking specifically about cross collaboration and giving an example. Or if you are seeing that you're going to be using Salesforce and you're seeing Salesforce come up 3 different times, then you want to make sure that you are talking about how you have used Salesforce, which is a tool, a technology, a SaaS, a software as a service program. You want to make sure that you're mentioning that. So that is just one thing that I always like to call out, because it is important when we think about the applicant tracking system. A lot of times the applicant tracking system, and we'll get more into this in just a moment, is that first check, especially if you are applying to, I would say, mid, to larger organizations. You're going to see a lot of those companies using an applicant tracking system, which most commonly Workday is one of the biggest ones, which a lot of people struggle with. And that's a whole, again, another topic for another day. But then there's other ones like ADP. There's also Greenhouse, and there's a bunch more. And now as the job market is continuing to evolve and we're seeing more technology come into place, we're seeing companies build new AI ATS systems. So we just have to make sure that when we're writing our resume, we are paying attention to the job description, we're reading it through thoroughly, We're looking for some of the keywords that you see coming up multiple times. If you're seeing that they're talking about a certain responsibility multiple times, those are good signals to tell you that those things are important, and those should most likely be in your resume. So any questions there before I go more into the ATS? Anything that I can clarify? Good? Okay. All right, then I'm going to move on here. All right, so moving into more of the ATS. So I found this visual and I thought this was like actually a really great depiction of how an applicant tracking system actually works. And so I just want to kind of walk through this because sometimes it's a matter of we just don't know what we don't know. And so an applicant tracking system, AKA ATS, for some can feel very ambiguous, and you hear a lot of people talking about you have to optimize for the ATS, you have to optimize for the ATS, but what does that mean? So let's talk about like what does the applicant tracking system actually do? So basically a recruiter, hiring manager, or someone within HR is going to open a job, and that's called a requisition. So they have a job posting that they need to fill. They will create the job description. Normally it is not typically the hiring manager that writes the job descriptions, but depending on the company, it might be, but typically it's someone within HR or recruiting. Once it gets signed off on, the job then gets published. It typically will get published both internally, which means on the company's job board, and then it also gets published externally. So think LinkedIn, Indeed, Glassdoor, ZipRecruiter. Those are the types of job boards. And then there's now other third-party job boards as well that will scrape for any job postings that are open and pull it into their site. So sometimes you'll notice that you'll see a job that it's posted, say, on LinkedIn, and not sometimes, but most times you'll see a job on LinkedIn, and then you'll go to the company website to actually apply. But I would always recommend applying through the company website if you can, because sometimes you'll see jobs posted on LinkedIn or on Indeed or whatever job boards you're using, but they're not actually open on the company website. So my recommendation there is go to the company website to apply. But once the job is posted, then job seekers start applying for the role. And so once the application is submitted, on the back end, what happens is that the resume is parsed. So basically the information, and the best example I can give of this is if you've ever applied through Workday, you may have seen where you upload your resume and then it's all jumbled and you have to go back and fix your entire application because the way it parsed the information is completely just jacked up. That is essentially on the back end. That's the system doing that. It's parsing the information. On the back end, though, your actual resume stays preserved. And my recommendation for submission of resume is PDF format. I don't recommend Word or any other format just because PDF retains the actual formatting of your resume, and that's what you want. You want it to stay preserved. So that would be my recommendation there. But essentially it goes into the system, it gets parsed, and then the way the ATS system works is going to look a little bit different depending on the company. So the example I'm going to use is Workday because a lot of you have probably applied to roles in Workday. Now, Workday has multiple products essentially that they offer. So they have their core offering, which is the database, the ATS database that a company can buy. But then from there, companies can buy add-ons. They can buy customizations, meaning that if a company, say, wants extra screening with AI, they can opt in and to that service and they can buy more of that. Or if they want a certain feature, they can buy that if they want to. So there isn't going to be like a standard advice in terms of like how every ATS system works. And if somebody says that there is, that's a lie, because they work differently depending on what the company buys into. But generally speaking, what you are going to find is that they pull the resume in. Most of these ATS systems are going to actually either rank and categorize your resume based on the job description. So not necessarily depending on when you apply, but how strong of a match is your resume against the actual job description. So some systems will actually give your resume a score, And if you say are at a 90% and you applied, you're the 200th person to apply, your resume is still going to get pulled up closer to the top because of the fact your resume scored high against the actual job description versus, say, someone who applied when the job just opened, but their resume is at maybe a 60%. So there are some applicant tracking systems that have that functionality, and I will say a lot more do, and we're seeing that become more of a theme. And especially as AI has continued to evolve, we're seeing a lot more screening happen with artificial intelligence. And typically what they are looking for is going to be, do you have your contact information? So a phone number, your email address, your location, your LinkedIn profile, not necessarily a portfolio, but it's a nice to have. Do you have your jobs listed in chronological order so that way they know what company you work for, the month and the year of when you work for those companies, start and end dates, the title that you held, and then your education and your skills. So those are typically the core categories that an applicant tracking system is going to screen against. And then depending on the AI technology, you're going to be categorized accordingly, because with some applicant tracking systems, for example, they'll actually be able to scan for keywords. And so if a recruiter is going into the database, looking at applications, and they see that yours is all green because you're hitting like all of the keywords versus someone else who's not, that is going to be something that, is going to help you stand out. So just things to kind of keep in mind in terms of how the functionality of an applicant tracking system is. But I will, again, just reiterate that I can't speak on behalf of every single applicant tracking system, but generally speaking, because I have worked out of a lot of different databases, this is what I've seen in my personal experience. But once that happens and then your resume gets screened, so it's either a yes or a no. So it goes into a pile where you're a probable match versus ones that are not qualified. And sometimes with not qualified, either your resume gets kind of pushed down towards the end of the application list, or some will automatically reject if it's not labeled as a fit. So sometimes you get those automatic rejections. That could be very well be why, because your resume didn't categorize and rank. It got ranked as not qualified, and therefore you're receiving a rejection email. But either way, whether you do get moved forward in the process or not, your information is stored. So they do keep that on file. And that's something that's good to know, just because sometimes you are applying, say, to a company and you've applied to the same company multiple times. Just know that your information is most likely on file, because they do tend to store that information. And a lot of times on the back end, they can see what roles you've applied to in the past. So it's just good to know. And then some companies will do an assessment, some will not. So I will say that that's like depending on the company. But then you go into interviews and then offer. So that's kind of the general rule of thumb when we think about the applicant tracking system. But I share that with you just because I think that's important to know, because that's one of the big questions that I get asked as we think about resume writing. So now that we've kind of walked through that part of this process, let's just talk about a few myths and truths really fast before we get into more of the core of the resume writing. So a few things that people will say, and I've heard myself, is that sometimes people will say, one resume fits all. You have to have fancy designs. You need to list your responsibilities. That is not the case. You really want to focus on the content over the design. You want to focus on building resume bullet points, which we will talk about, that show your impact. And I will explain more of what that means and give you actual examples. And then tailoring the resume is something that is going to be important, with the caveat, because I will be very, very, very clear, and this is a hill that I will die on. I don't think that it is feasible for someone to sit and tailor their resume for every single job that they're applying to. That's the fastest way to burnout. So what I typically will tell people is take the time on the front end before you start submitting applications to really pay attention to what are you actually going after. So if you are a project manager or program manager, or maybe you are in supply chain, get clear on like what are the actual roles that you're targeting. And then pay attention to the overlap in the themes across those roles. And I'll go into that more here in a second, because that's going to help you a lot and save you a lot of time and energy on the back end. And that will make it so you don't have to sit and try and tailor your resume for every job. And again, that is the fastest way to burnout. And I don't believe that anybody should have to tailor their resume for every single job that they're applying to. So I want to be very clear about that. But now going more into the anatomy of the resume. So I wanted to just give you an example. So this is a resume that I personally have written for somebody. And I will just give you kind of the caveat of saying, like, this is one way, to write a resume. Sometimes some of it is going to be based on this person's situation. So Lawrence, I think yours is a good example that we're going to talk about a little bit later, like when you are trying to tackle gaps, or maybe when you've been doing some freelancing, this structure may look a little bit different, because really what we have to think about in the world of resume writing is that we get to pick and choose what the employer sees about our experience. So we don't have to list every single job. We sometimes, quite frankly, when it comes to writing of the resume, we're going to amplify certain parts of our experience and expand, and some parts we just want to make mention of it. So we'll get into more of the details around like when you should be doing those things, but you get to decide what the employer sees from your experience. And that is really powerful, because you get to control the narrative. And so that's where sometimes people think they have to put everything on their resume. And it's like, no, you don't. But you want to try and make sure that you're guiding the employer, whether it be the recruiter or the hiring manager, to see your experience the way that you want to make sure that they see it and how it registers, so that they can see that you're the one for the job, that you have the skills and the qualifications. And I'll talk more about what that actually means. But the typical structure, when we think about just generally speaking, is always going to be these core things that you want to have is the contact info. So you want to make sure you have your name, your phone, your email, city and state, your country. If you're out of the United States, have the city and the country, your LinkedIn profile. If you are in a field where, say, you're in marketing, or maybe you're a software engineer, you want to have some sort of portfolio. So just knowing your industry is going to be important, because knowing your industry and paying attention to what type of materials people typically have, and that's normally going to be around some sort of portfolio or website. You want to just make sure that that if you need to have one, that you take the time to build it out. But outside of that, then I typically like to have a professional summary, or what I call a Reels highlights. Is this a mandatory section? No, this is one that I like to have, and I believe it's the anatomy of a strong resume. But the other sections, the skills, core competencies, that's a non-negotiable. You want to have those on your resume. And I typically recommend having it broken up by industry skills versus the technical skills. And the technical skills are going to be things like SQL, so SQL, Python. It might be Salesforce, NetSuite, Microsoft Word, Excel. Like, those are things, if you're seeing them in the job descriptions, those would go under technical skills. Industry skills are going to be more of things like financial modeling, budgeting and analysis, project management. Those are going to be more considered industry skills. So you do want to have those, because, again, thinking about the applicant tracking system, but then also thinking about once it gets into the hands of a recruiter, you want to be able to give them an opportunity to kind of skim through and see those key points that they're looking for, and then do that click down into your resume. Then from there, we go into the work experience. So you always want to have, of course, company, job title. I highly recommend month and year. There are some instances where I will say just put the years, but typically I will recommend month and years. And the only time I really recommend just years is maybe if you were at a company, excuse me, and it was a shorter like tenure, where it's like you started in 2023 and ended in 2024, but it was only for like 4 months, for example. I might say, okay, let's just put the years, because we want to give like that perception of maybe more of the longevity. But typically you want to put month and year. And then we want to have our scope, and we also want to have the impact focus bullet points, education, degree, concentration, university. If you don't have a degree, that is fine. I would say if you have certifications, put the certifications in there as part of your education, or just put your latest education because that'll be something they most likely look for. And then there's some optional sections that we have here, which are more of the certifications, awards, projects, volunteer work. So we'll talk about that a bit more here as we go along. But before we write a single word, and this is kind of what I was alluding to a few moments ago, I very, very, very strongly, and I wish I could emphasize this and just really tell you how strongly I feel about this, but very strongly feel that if you take the time to define what you're targeting, so what roles are you targeting, I recommend sticking with 2, maybe 3 role profiles max. And if you are going to say look at role profiles, ideally you want to have ones that overlap. So the example I can give you is if you're an account manager, maybe you apply for account manager role, account executive role, maybe you apply for customer success roles. Those typically have overlap in the skills. And so you want to pay attention to where's the overlap, because that's going to be how you maximize your resume and you're able to write it in a way where you're not having to spend so much time tailoring the resume. So I really strongly recommend define your target roles down to industries if possible, and then just pay attention to the keywords. So what do you keep seeing come up? So look at maybe 10 to 15 job descriptions and pay attention. What are the themes? Because there's always themes. And what you'll notice is that a lot of these job roles, there's a lot of overlap in the responsibilities, as well as the tools that they're using, as well as the keywords that they call out in the actual job description. So when I say research the market, that's what I mean is pay attention to the job descriptions, pull in some job descriptions, just analyze them. And then that's going to tell you, okay, I need to make sure that I have XYZ in my resume. And if I have this in my resume, this means that for majority of the roles that I apply to, I'm going to be touching a lot of the key points that they're asking for. And that's the goal. So that would be my word of advice to you. And that's typically how I approach resume writing is this is what I do. I will spend that time on the front end doing that for that reason, to help save someone time on the back end. So they're not having to be so stressed out tailoring their resume. The other thing I will just say is you want to take some time to understand your career story. And so again, at the end of this, I am going to be sending out a resume template for the people that attended, along with the actual SSIP framework that I use to help you tell your story. So questions that you can answer, so that way you can start to identify what is your career story to help you write stronger resumes, but not only for resume writing, it's going to also help you for interviews as well. So just know it's like kind of a catch-all, this framework, but you want to understand your career story. You want to be able to define your value proposition, and then you want to think about where you're going next. So a lot of times we're just focused on what we've done in the past, which is, yes, we're presenting them our experience from what we have done previously, but we want to focus on the experience that is most relevant to where we're trying to go. So you may, again, or may not have heard people talk about focus on where you're going and write for where you're going. That's what they mean. So you take your previous experience, the work that you've done in your previous roles, and pull out examples that are going to really directly align with where you're going next. And so that's where doing that market research on the front end, like I just discussed, will help you tell that story and pull from your experience to focus on where you're going next. And I put a little reflection exercise in here, but this is, for later, so don't worry about pulling out notebooks or anything now. But I would just say, if you have some time, write down your top 5 to 6 skills that you have seen in your experience where maybe people have called out that you're known for, or that that you feel very strongly about. And then also, what are some of the problems that you've solved, that you've helped with in some of your past organizations, because that's really strong information to help you define your career story as well. Now, going back one more time to looking at the anatomy of the resume. So I just want to kind of wrap this up before we go into focusing on resume writing with more bullet points. So just kind of to recap here, we want to make sure when we're writing the resume that we're really focusing on the key elements, and that you have those key elements in your resume. And then there are going to be some other optional sections that you can include, but these are the ones where you want to make sure that you do not miss. And so a few things that I get in terms of like location, for example, is One being, well, what do I do if, say, I'm trying to relocate? How do I list that on my resume? So that's, one of those kind of edge case scenarios. Well, if you're trying to relocate, then I typically will tell people either put the location of where you're going, because typically recruiters are not going to prioritize people who are not in the local area. That's just a fact. Or if you're not comfortable with doing that, make a note underneath your location that you are actively looking to relocate to that location that they are interested in hiring for. You want to make sure that they know that you are actually either going to be moving there or you're interested in going there. So that's one of those kind of things that I want to make sure to call out in location, but otherwise everything else should be pretty self-explanatory here. Any questions before I continue on? I know I've gone through a lot of information, so I want to give space if anyone has questions right now. No? Okay. Okay, perfect. All right, if you do, just feel free to put them into the chat. I'm going to be answering questions at the end. So this one part here, the professional summary, which going back here is this top section right here. This is the professional summary. And that's what I have here is a 3 to 4 sentence, AKA your career pitch. So this is something that is not mandatory, but I personally like to include it. And the reason why is just because I have seen people have a lot of success with that. So I've tested it both with and without it. And I've seen more engagement when it's included. So that's why I personally choose to include a professional summary. Some people will have this, instead of having kind of a paragraph format, they'll have it as like a few bullet points. Either one is fine. But I would say this is something that I would test out, especially say if maybe you're not getting a lot of traction on your resume and you don't have this in your resume, maybe add this in and see how that changes the responses that you're getting. But as far as what it is, it's your elevator pitch. So it's like high level, your 3 to 4 sentences, especially if you're in a 2-page resume. You want to keep in mind that this is going to be what they pay attention to. So normally from like here, oh, that's a bad line, up is what they pay attention to on the first page. That is the amount of time that you get to capture their attention, is that first page, probably the first third of the page. So that's where having something like this can be helpful, because if maybe you have something that is on the second page that really you want to land, then you could maybe incorporate that into your summary. But just know that this is something that you have to decide based on the roles that you're applying to, but know that that first page is always going to be the most important. So, but here in this case, for our purposes, it's 3 to 4 sentences, top of your resume, elevator pitch, and it's basically like a movie trailer is the best way that I can describe it. So normally what I tell people, it's, start with your story, your skills, your impact, and then your proposition. So it's your current or past role, number of years of experience that you have. Then you want to talk about your function or industry and some maybe key value areas that you own. And then your top 2 to 3 capabilities, something that you've delivered in terms of impact. And then what are you targeting next? So that's the normal framework that I tend to follow with writing this section. And then I have an example here that you all can see, just breaking it down for someone as an operations analyst with a background in supply chain, and then someone who's a former educator. So that's the career summary there that you can try out if you have not used that in your resume. And if you currently have that in your resume, maybe try making some tweaks based on this recommendation here and seeing if that helps. Now, going into more of the work experience, and we're going to spend a lot of time here because this is the part that matters the most, is your bullet points, what content you're putting into the experience section. So a lot of people will list their duties. They're going to list their responsibilities. They're going to say, I was responsible for, I helped do this. We want to focus on the value, and that's where the SIP, so scope, skill, impact, proposition, writing your bullet points in this format, I promise you is going to help translate and for you get better results in landing interviews. This is gold because this is the way corporate thinks. A lot of companies, they want to know not just what you did, which is your scope. They want to know at what scale are you operating? So who is your work impacting? Is it just you? Is it your team? Are you working with in one state? Are you working in multiple states? Like, what's the scale of how your work is impacting? What did you actually do? What was the impact and results? And then what is your proposition? So that proposition is tied to your impact there. So if you can explain the impact, that becomes your proposition. So we don't want to just list duties. We do want to include some metrics. We don't have to have numbers in every single bullet point. And that's something I want to make sure that you guys know too, is that yes, we want to have impact. We want to have numbers where we can, but it doesn't have to be in every single bullet point. It's more so about what does the bullet point say. And then you want to make sure that you're aligning it again with the jobs that you're actually applying to. So that part is really important. Then going into the actual framework, so the SSIP framework, and again, that is scope. What did you own or lead? Scale, so how big? What did you have a budget? What was your team size if you were a manager? What markets did you own? Impact, what changed because of the work that you did? What improved? And then how does this align with your next role? So the example that I have here is someone where I took their bullet point, and so they overhauled this entire program. And initially, I should have actually had the initial bullet point, but they just talked about overhauling onboarding program that impacted employees. That was the bullet point. But come to find out and digging into this person's experience, I'm like, literally, you did this over 3 global hubs. Like, why are we not talking about this? This was across 2,300 people. Like, why is this not in that bullet point? Because 500 people, 100 people versus 2,300 people, like, hello, like, I'm sorry, but that shows the scale in which you're operating. And also when we think about the impact, so she was able to pull the metrics because she had internal reporting, and that showed that this process actually reduced average ramp time, so that the onboarding to hire time by 38%, which that right there, like if someone says, okay, this person not just overhauled an onboarding program, like anybody can overhaul an onboarding program, and yes, that's impactful, but like being able to explain and show versus just tell what that impact is so powerful. Because if someone else is just saying that they overhauled an onboarding system, but you're coming out with something like this, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna hire you. Like, and if they still pass on your resume, I'm gonna call them up and say, like, did you not see this person's bullet point? Because like, this is insane. Like, this is awesome that they were able to do this. So this is the type of focus that we want to have to the best of our ability. And granted, for me, this is my day-to-day. So I recognize that, like, I make it maybe sound easy, but I know it's not easy to do because we're not taught. Most of us were not taught how important it is to track the work that we're doing, to be able to articulate our experience in this way, to be able to advocate for ourselves and to own what we do. And this is where you can do that in writing. And that's why I want to make sure that at the end of this, I give you a framework so you can start doing that for yourselves, because this is going to be how you write better resume bullet points. This is going to be how you answer questions in the interviews much more confidently, and you give them the information that they're probably actually looking for because you've gone through and you identified your SIP. So you know your SIP. This is what we want to focus on here. But let me go further on because I could go on and on about the SIP, but I just want to give you a few more bullet point examples. So these were ones that were actually on resumes that I have worked on in the past. So someone, had just put that they managed interns, but come to find out they managed, or supervised in this case was what I changed it to, 12 interns across operations and marketing. So across 2 different functions, 2 different teams. So it wasn't just one team. They improved the onboarding and they converted 6 people to full-time roles. And this all happened in under 6 months. That tells a much different story than just saying I managed interns. The same thing with saying I handled the department budget. Well, this person managed a $12 million budget. Like, that is not a small budget to manage. Like, I can even think about managing a $12 million budget across 3 fiscal years, and they identified a 1.6 million cost saving opportunity. So they saved the company money. So when we think about the impact, like, this type of stuff lands. But some of you might be thinking, well, I don't have these type of numbers. I don't have impact like this. I don't know how to quantify, or I can't quantify. Yes, you can. And so we're going to talk about other ways to quantify, because it's not always going to be based on dollar signs and percentages. So there are other opportunities where you can still show the impact. And so I want to make sure that you know what that looks like. But this is essentially kind of the guideline that you're looking for when you think about writing strong resume bullet points. You want to really think about your experience and spend some time really thinking about what you've done. And maybe you look at past performance reviews, Maybe you sit down and you just like start writing it out. You may not have all the information, but things will start to come up like as you start to remember. So I would encourage you to start doing that if you haven't done that in a while. But in terms of metrics, I want to circle back on this. So again, some people say, Erica, I don't have metrics. No, you do. You absolutely do, and you can quantify. I promise you, every single person in this room can quantify. So some of the ways that you can quantify is going to be based on frequency. How often are you doing something? How much time did you save? Accuracy. So if you're maybe in more of a compliance role and you have consistently hit 100% on all of your audits over the past 12 months, like that's a big deal. Satisfaction scores. So maybe you're in a customer success manager role and they have NPS, so net promoter scores. Maybe you have consistently hit a 4.95 out of 5 again over the past 2 years, and month over month have hit that number, and you actually received kudos and received an award internally. Like that is something that is going to land, because that tells them not just what you did, but why does this matter? And that's what we want them to see. And then you can also think about things like your ranking. So maybe you work in a store and you're a store manager and you're working for a chain of like 200 stores across the US, and your store consistently ranks number 3 out of 200 stores. Like that's a big deal. That's under your leadership. So those are things that you can do to show other ways that you can quantify, that you can really show that impact there. A couple things here for some of y'all that maybe are trying to get into those next level roles. So maybe you have been an individual contributor and you are trying to break that threshold of like, how do I break into a manager role? And I keep getting boxed into these individual contributor roles. And one way that you can do that, because if you haven't formally, say, been in a managerial role where you've held a managerial title, think about other things that you've done that's maybe that are outside of the workplace. So I actually pulled my personal resume. This is my old resume from Google. So when I was working at Google, I was a senior technical recruiter, but I also, part of what I did is I volunteered for the internal employee resource group. And I was the global events lead. And so I didn't hold an actual leadership title. I was an individual contributor, but I was trying to show my leadership experience. And so I used that as a way to show my leadership experience, because I was managing programs, these events that for not just for the US, but this was for all of the regions. And I had to coordinate with internal and external stakeholders, and I actually had to manage teams in order to make sure that we were delivering on these events that we were committing to. So think about how you've done that in other environments. Maybe you're doing that in an employee resource group where you're at, or maybe you volunteer outside of the workplace and you're on a board, for example. Think about where you can incorporate some of that, or maybe you have a personal project that you're on, and maybe you are doing some like freelancing, for example, on the side, and you're the one that's having to lead and manage, because it's on you whether you work with these clients or not. It's on you to make sure that the work gets done. You're typically having to work with people from their team, so you can talk about how you have had to have some of that leadership over, the teams maybe that you're working with as part of the freelancing that you're doing, as an example. So think about how you can what you're doing outside of your core role. And then even within your core role, if you're someone who is maybe tapped on the shoulder to train people all the time, yes, you're not technically like their manager and overseeing, but that shows that you have leadership capabilities, because they're not going to be asking you to do that if they don't see you as someone who can lead in the way of getting someone up to speed to be able to perform their job well. So those are things you want to start thinking about if you feel like you're being boxed in to an individual contributor role, but you really want to make sure that you're trying to show your leadership skills. And so just here a few final best guidelines and best practices. So some questions that I get, and I just want to address these. So how far back should I go? So typically for most professionals, 10 years is going to be the average, but I would say like 10 to 15 years would be my general rule of thumb. And then I still would say if like you have experience that goes further back than that, and you do want to show that experience because it's relevant to a role that you're trying to apply to, instead of having dates, you can have an earlier career section. You can list the job role, do not put dates, and then you can list a few of the bullet points that are directly applicable to the experience that you're trying to tailor your resume for a role that you're interested in. So that's typically how I would approach that. But again, general rule of thumb is 10 to 15 years of experience. And then if you're changing, careers, you want to typically go like 5 to 7 years back. And again, probably have like an earlier career section. So maybe you want to have more of a relevant career section, and then one that's like additional experience. So they can see that, yes, you've had other roles, but you're not amplifying that because it's just not relevant to where you're trying to go next. But you do have work experience and industry experience from earlier on. And then government is a whole separate story. So government, depending on what part of the government you fall into, but if it's typically if you are going into like state, or I would say state government or federal government, a lot of times they do want more rather than less. So I actually just did a workshop with the state of Michigan, and that was one of the things they want all of your experience. So you want to be more comprehensive if you're applying for government jobs. Yeah. And then how many bullet points per job? So this is another one I get. So when we look at resumes, what is most current? So what you did most recently is typically going to be what is most relevant to the employer. So if you are writing out your resume, normally say you had a job that was from 2022 to 2020, January of 2025, that role, you're probably going to have 5 to 7 bullet points. You may even actually have more if you're going to be breaking your bullet points into categories. And maybe you have like a couple of bullet points under certain categories that you want to make sure that you're emphasizing. So maybe you want to showcase project management, operations, and then budget management. And you have 3 separate categories under that one role, and only have maybe 3 bullet points under that if you're trying to show different parts of your experience within one job that you've held. But normally you're going to have 5 to 7 bullet points for mid-level roles. So that means like any roles that are going to be maybe like 7+ years back, you're probably going to have like 3 to 5 bullet points. And then earlier career roles, so these are going to be the ones that the only word that's coming to mind is outdated, which I don't want to say that because the experience is not outdated. Like it's your career story, but from the perspective of a recruiter, they're going to pay attention to current, which to them is most relevant. So that early career, you maybe are going to have 1 to 2 bullet points, or you may not have any bullet points. You may just have the role because you want them to know that you worked for this company in this specific role, but maybe you don't put bullet points. You just want them to know that you actually worked there. So that's where you kind of have to decide how many bullet points, but that's kind of the general guideline that I give to people in terms of like how to decipher how many bullet points to include in your resume. A few other points here is going to be, should you list every job that you've ever had? No, I don't believe in listing every single job. So again, as we think about going the kind of that 10 to 15 year mark being the sweet spot, you want to think about what is going to be most relevant to the employer, which is what is most recent. So what you did in your very last role or the one that you're currently in, that's going to be where they're going to really spend most of their time, at least at first, before they go back. So you want to focus on what's the relevant roles are to them, and then showing those transferable skills in those roles. If you have jobs where maybe you were there for, say, a short tenure, and maybe it gives that appearance of job hopping. So maybe you've had a bunch of contract roles and they were, 3 months here, 6 months here. Is there a way that we can just eliminate some of those and just focus on the ones where either they're most relevant or where you spent the most time? Because that's a situation where I would say you want to probably take some of those out in order for you not to be labeled as a job hopper and for you to get more responses. And I have personally seen this happen on multiple occasions for people that will do that, and then all of a sudden they're getting interviews. So you, again, get to decide what the employer actually sees from your experience. So this is where you have to use your best judgment to decide what do you want them to see. And then going into the freelance part, so Lawrence, I know this one is more so for you. In freelancing, sometimes you've done a lot of different projects within freelancing. So I typically will recommend if you need to group them. So maybe there is a certain type of freelance project that you've done and it's similar for the same like past 3 companies that you work for. You could probably just have one line that lists out the companies, and then you could just list the bullet points. So that way they know that, hey, this work that I did applies to these 3 companies versus listing it out for every single company. And then it's also redundant. So just thinking about how you can streamline, but also help guide the reader. And then if you have any like outdated like tools and systems, I would, be cautious there just because we want to focus on what they're actually asking for in terms of systems and technologies that you're using. Oh, I put this twice. Whoops. Okay. So now we have skills section. So I did talk about this a little bit earlier, but yes, we absolutely want to have a skills section. So we want to focus on the technical and the functional industry skills. So I had talked about earlier, technical being like Excel, SAP, QuickBooks, Power BI, those would be considered technical skills. Functionality / industry skills would be budget forecasting, stakeholder management, project management, financial modeling, account management, like those would technically fall under the category of the industry skills. So those could go into, you could have those in one section there. Soft skills, I typically will tell people to avoid soft skills because really that's fluff. It doesn't really tell the recruiter or the hiring manager anything. Instead of writing I'm a team player or I'm hardworking, just give an example of how you are a team player. So you maybe like in terms of team player, the example, maybe that you want to put as a bullet point is that you are the one that, again, going back to training, you're the one that consistently is called upon by your manager for any new people that are coming onto the team to train those team members and get them up to speed on best practices for the goals of the team. And that shows, like that example right there is showing them that you're a team player because you're being called upon, but you're actually the one that's doing it. So you are a team player versus saying I'm a team player. So just think about removing those if you do have those in your resume. And then going back to the optional section. So I just wanted to call these out one more time. If you have certifications, especially if they're industry certifications, those could be really strong to have because of the fact that if you are applying for roles where certifications carry, weight, it's great. So if you're a project manager, the PMP, if you are in human resources, the SHRM, the SHRM, if you are in, I'm thinking about like products, so maybe like a Scrum Master, they have certifications there too. So think about like what are the industry specific certifications. If you have any of those certifications, I would absolutely include those because you want to show professional development in that way. And also it could be used to help you bridge any gaps. So if you don't have the hands-on work experience, but you have the certifications, you want them to see that while you haven't been in this role formally, you are actively upskilling, you are investing in yourself, you are trying to make sure that you're showing them that you have the know-how. So that's where those come in. Projects can come into play as well. And this is going to be more so maybe for like creative or like in the technical realm where maybe you haven't been in the role before. So maybe you're social media manager, you want to get into digital marketing, but maybe you build out a case study, a project, and you talk about that because you're trying to show and demonstrate those skills. Certain fields, publications are important. And then volunteer work can be another good way, again, to show experience, especially if you're trying to break in to a role or field that you haven't been in. Awards or honors, and then languages, especially if it's a role where they are talking about how language is important. And if you know multiple languages, like if you have that skill where you've learned multiple languages, then you want to include that in your resume too. And last couple of things here, so just a bonus. So I alluded to this earlier, but I do want to call out that SSIP is not just for resumes. So as you're thinking about your self-evaluations, performance reviews, promotion conversations, interviewing, this framework will help get you organized to very much be ready to go into any of those types of conversations. So I would very highly recommend spending some time. If you are willing to put in a little bit of work here on the front end, it is going to pay dividends in terms of your career growth, but then also if you're actively in the job market for your upcoming interviews as well, because your stories are going to be a lot stronger. All right, so questions. I know we had a couple of questions. I want to answer those questions. I know we're almost at time. I'm happy to stay on. If people have questions, I can answer them. But I want to answer Lawrence. I'm going to answer your question first. So you talked about work gaps, and then you also talked about being a caretaker for a couple of years, and you want to know what the best practices are, and then you've been freelancing. So this one is a very good, one. I'm glad you brought this up. In terms of gaps, Lawrence, if you're willing to share in the chat, how many years or months are the gaps that you have in your current experience? No, maybe. Okay, I'm gonna make it up. I'm gonna go and make it up. So gaps, if you have gaps in your resume, anything that I would say is like in this current market, I would say if it's more than 6 months, you probably want to address it, whether you're putting into your resume that you're on a sabbatical, whether you put into your resume that you're a caretaker. You don't have to have bullet points tied to it. You can just have caretaking for a parent or whoever, and then the date starting from when to when. So that way they know that, like, hey, this time is accounted for, that you right now have been in that caretaking mode. Or if you say we're actively working on a certification that took up your time, you can put that a professional development, and then you can list the certification, and then you can list the date in which you completed it or anticipated completion date. So those are going to be ways for gaps, how you can bridge those gaps. Otherwise, in terms of how you can potentially also bridge that outside of that, I would say for you, it's going to depend on how long the gaps were. So say if maybe earlier in your career, and an example that I can give you of this is that I had somebody who was in the military, and they were in the military for like 15 years. Then they came back. They stopped working. So they were out of the workforce for 12 years. They went back into the workforce, and they started their work in 2021. And they had been working since 2021, but prior to that, they had not worked. So instead of listing all of their military experience and then putting this gap and then putting this 2021 job, what we did is that we just focused on the 2021 job, and then at the very bottom we put earlier experience was in the military, because then that shows that yes, this person has been in the workforce, in this case in the military, but what we're focusing on is what's most recent, what's most relevant, which is their 2021 experience. So that would be, how I would recommend that. But if you have any questions specifically around how to address gaps, I'm happy to look at your specific scenario and give you guidance on that, because some of that is going to also be based on your scenario too. There's a few more questions here I want to make sure I answer. And career choices. Okay, so we have career choices have kind of gotten me stuck in academia, and I'm trying desperately to pivot out. So in terms of pivoting out right now, that, yes, can be a bit tricky in today's job market because of the amount of competition there is in the job market, but it's possible. I've seen people make the pivot. I would say the biggest thing in terms of pivoting out of academia, I would start putting yourself in the places where you're trying to go next. So the example that I'm going to give you here is there's someone who was in academia and research, wanted to pivot into a data analyst role. So what I had advised her to do was to start creating a portfolio. So creating her own projects to show that she has the capability to be a data analyst. She also took a certification, but then outside of that, she was part of Women in Data and actually volunteered as part of the Women in Data in Seattle. And the combination of those things, being able to show that on the resume, she was able to land a role outside of academia. So it would, again, depend on your specific scenario and what you're trying to pivot out of. But that would be kind of the general gist of like how I would recommend is like, you're going to have to kind of zoom out and see how can I demonstrate this experience when I haven't been in the industry, haven't been in the role. And what can you do, to make sure that you're in the spaces where those people are, and how can you start to maybe volunteer your time, or look at possibly smaller organizations, startups that may be more willing to bring people that have experience that are outside of kind of the traditional field in which they're hiring for, because they're scaling up. So that could be another way as well, as to look at smaller companies too. All right, so the degree, so KT, okay, so we have, for the degree, how specific should we get if you don't have a degree with specific majors mentioned, but a closely associated major? I have added concentration with the keyword, but not sure if that has been effective. So you don't have the degree with the specific majors. Okay, so you're saying, if you're still here, Katie, are you saying in like the job description, if say they're asking for a specific degree, like a specific major, but you don't have that major, but you have like the concentration listed for that? Is that what you're referring to? Okay, yeah, so I would say the concentration is good. The other thing that you can also do in that scenario is that if you've taken some specific courses, even if it's like a while back, it's fine. You can list the concentration, and then you can have relevant courses, and then you can list a few of those relevant courses too, because it can just help to like bridge that gap, that perceived gap, because some companies, depending on what you're applying to, they do hire based, if they're saying, hey, we want someone that has a computer science degree, for example, and they're calling that out explicitly, they may be sticklers about that. But if you could show that you have a concentration and maybe a minor in, computer science as an example, and I've taken these courses, that can help to bridge that gap. So that's how I would approach that specifically. And then Helen, will there be a replay? Yes, I'm recording this, so I will share that out. Okay, and then Lauren said he was having problems because he didn't have the numbers, but I'll give you guys some guidance there. There's other ways to quantify. Is there a range of numbers too small to present directly for impact and advisable to quantify impact based on the recommended alternative way to show it? Yes. So this is a good question. So the example that I can give you, Katie, is if you are, say, trying to show an improvement of like, let's say 50%, like maybe you increase something by 50% versus like the number, if you were to write it out as a number, it was over like 3 people, but the increase was 50%, I would put the 50% versus putting 3 people, just because the 50% is going to carry more weight. So just depending on the example that you're trying to show, sometimes it's better to say estimate a percentage versus putting a number, because yes, sometimes when in terms of thinking about the impact, the perception that is an important factor. So I would think about how you, and it, like if you're quantifying, say, for example, you want to look at the number of times you're doing something, like those are things that I think would be safer bet. But if you're trying to say like a specific number around like dollar amounts, for example, maybe like the budget that you owned was smaller. So maybe instead of focusing on the budget, maybe you focus, and it was like a $10,000 budget, but on the other side of it, you were able to save the company, year over year 15%, like I would focus on the 15% versus maybe a smaller budget, especially if the company's asking for you to have managed large scale budgets of like $1 million or more. So you have to figure out like how you can kind of shape that narrative a little bit. But that would be my recommendation in terms of like how to kind of finesse that a bit. Hopefully that helps. Okay. So with things outside of the role, but within the same employer, so these volunteer boards, for instance, would you put that in the same experience section as the job? Good question. So this is something where if you have been in a volunteer role and you are doing it, say, as your full-time job, I personally would recommend I put in my experience section. But if it's something that you are, say, doing in addition to a job that you're already holding, like a full-time job, then I would probably put that into its own section where I would have that as like additional experience. Or you can have that as volunteer. I personally like to put additional experience and then list that out. That's my personal preference, but that's how I would make the distinction. Because sometimes, say, if you have been out of like the workforce for a while, but you have been heavily volunteering, you're heavily involved, like that truly is for you, like your full-time job, I would list that as your experience because it's work that you're doing. Granted, work doesn't mean you have to get paid for it. And that's the, sometimes people fall into that, like, well, I'm not getting paid for this. Are you doing the work or not? Yes, you are. So list it as experience because you want to make sure that they see that experience that you have. So that's how I personally, Sarah, would approach it in terms of how to list that. And then in terms of very specific questions, so would cross-functional leadership be considered a soft skill versus something strong enough to go into skill section? So cross-functional leadership, I would absolutely put that into like an industry skill because that, especially with a lot of jobs, you see a lot of jobs ask for cross-functional or cross-functional management, cross-functional leadership. I would go ahead and put that into an industry skills section. And then security clearance, I would put that up top in your near your contact information. So next to maybe your location, you could have like full security clearance and then list the level of clearance that you have. Or if you have a summary, professional summary, at the end of that professional summary, you can put that you have professional security clearance and then the level of security clearance that you have. So either one is fine. And then for mid-career professionals, lengthwise, okay, seeking a promotion. So what is the recommendation for length? Okay, so if you're mid-career, you're kind of in that space of the in-between where, depending on where you are at mid-career, so I would say rule of thumb is if you have like 1 to maybe 5, 6 years of experience, typically you can have that in one page normally, unless there's just a lot of work that you've done and you really need to have that second page. Like I would say that would be a discussion where I would try and encourage you maybe keep it in one page, but normally you can have it in one page out. But once you get to the like 7+ year mark, that's where it's a little bit more gray, because you have enough industry experience to where you technically, yes, you could go into a second page. So typically where I see people start to go into a second page is at like 8+ years of experience. But my rule of thumb with that is always going to be, are you giving enough information? And this is the key point, because if you're not giving enough context, and some people try and cram everything into one page where they list, all of these achievements, and then there's no context around what were they actually doing, like what was the actual scope of their work, that typically doesn't give the employer enough information to make a decision. So you have to find that sweet spot between showing and telling. And that, for me, where I see that happen is around like 8+ years, where people start to tend to maybe go into a second page, but normally it ends up being like a page and a half. But if you are going to go into a second page, I would definitely recommend having a solid 1.5 pages. If it's like 1.25 page, I'm going to tell you to pick a side. Either you're in a 1-page resume or you're going to go into a clear second page resume. Sorry, I'm trying to go back. Okay, and my industry also values publications, which leads, okay, yeah, absolutely. So Katie, so that's totally fine. If your industry values publications, you're good. You're fine with the second page. I would say keep it to 2 pages though. What industry are you in, Katie? Just so I know. Okay, yeah. So I would say for you, how many years of experience do you have? Thanks, Judith. 5 years. Okay, so you should be fine to stay in the second page. Okay. All right, a couple more questions. Let's see, what do we have here? I have a job after my undergraduate studies in 2010 to 2014. Should I keep the years in my resume? 2010 to 2014. So that is, yes, you could, if the role is very relevant to what you are targeting. Yes, I would go ahead and just keep the years. I would say within the next like 2 years, then you want to go ahead and drop that into an early career section. But right now it's kind of in that, again, in that in-between phase. But but I want to make sure that it's relevant. If it's relevant to the type of roles that you're targeting, yes, go ahead and put the role and then put the years there. And then if I've been looking for work for 6+ months since my last role, is this considered a career gap that would need to be addressed on the resume, or does the end date of the previous, okay, that's a good question. So Sarah, very transparently, I will say that you're not alone in terms of like timelines. Timelines are getting longer for people to find jobs. So I just want to validate and say like you're not alone in that. But in terms of gaps, so technically, yes, would that be considered a gap where an employer would have questions? Yes, that would be considered a gap. In today's job market, it's on average is taking people like 6 to 9 months is the average timeline to find job roles. That's the norm. So I would say for you, if you have maybe, I don't know if you've done any like trainings or if you're volunteering anywhere or anything like that, but if you are doing like some volunteer work, then I would go ahead and put that into your resume. And if you're not, then I would just leave it for right now, since you're at the 6-month mark. I would say if you maybe get into, we're in June, so July, August. So I would say if we're still talking about this come September, then I would probably want to make sure that you have something in the resume just to show because that's something that is inevitably going to be a question that comes up. Hopefully does that answer your question? Yes. Is it advisable to keep years of graduation from, good, yes, remove it. If you are more than 10 years, definitely drop the graduation year. There's a lot of bias that comes with the hiring process. Bias is inevitable. There's no way to beat bias. But when it comes to resume review, whatever you can do to mitigate bias, which is why some of these recommendations for like the 10 to 15 years and all of this comes into play, there's bias in the hiring process. And you don't want to have, to the best of your ability, you want to mitigate for that. And one of the ways that you can do that is drop the education. Definitely once you hit the 10-year mark, for sure, by that period of time, you can go ahead and drop the years off of your education. Okay, and then Lawrence said that he's been caretaking since the pandemic, so 5 years. Okay. And then before that was working trade shows as data entry customer service, since those two fall into the 10-year work experience. Okay, so Lawrence, so basically Lawrence has been caretaking for the past 5 years. Before that, Lawrence worked in trade shows, data entry, and customer service. Those fall into the 10-year work experience. So for you, what I would do, Lawrence, is I would have those roles and I would have some experience there, because that is industry experience that you do want to show. I know it's like a little bit further back, but because you have been caretaking for some time right now, you want to just be able to show like, yes, I did have, some work experience prior to this. So I would personally put that in there and have a few bullet points. And then I would very explicitly call out that you were caretaking, and then list the timeline for caretaking. And then I would, in terms of freelancing, because I think you said you were also doing freelancing. So then any like of that freelancing work, I would have that as like your current work that you're doing. So you can show them that you're like, yes, while I was caretaking, essentially I was doing freelancing because I was trying to juggle being a caretaker and I needed the flexibility of being in freelancing. So that's kind of the story that we want to tell there. Yes, it's fine to put work authorization on your resume. If you put work authorization, just focus on the fact that you have work authorization. So don't give any specifics around like dates or anything like that. Just put yes, just eligible to work in the US. And then cover letters, is a cover letter recommended? If it's not specifically requested, what if you want to relocate? So cover letter is one of those things where this is going to be a time and energy type of situation that I typically tell people. I normally tell people if you are really excited, and then, for you, Katie, you're in pharma. So in pharma, I do tend to see more cover letters being read. You're in an industry where that is something where I personally, for you, would recommend to have cover letters. But in typically as a whole, you will find that it's pretty hit or miss if a cover letter is read. So I would say out of like percentage wise, probably 75%, and this from my experience and what I've seen, people don't read cover letters versus the 25% that do. So when we think about should I write a cover letter or not, I would personally recommend, if you are really excited about a job opportunity, yes, write the cover letter, because you want to do what you can to maximize the chance for you to get in the door. And that's something that is within your control, which is writing the cover letter. But if you're just like, hey, this role's fine, like, and it's not really one that you're like super, super excited about, I would say typically just submitting applications is fine. Yeah. So that is going to depend on Sarah. So Sarah said my state's employment agency said that many employers actively admit they don't read it, but still ding people if they don't have one submitted. It's going to very much depend on the industry that you're in, and then it's going to depend on the employer. But generally speaking, like I will say, like I still stand by the whole 75-25. And if they're asking for a cover letter and it's like optional, then I would say like it's going to be hit or miss if they read it. I personally haven't seen a lot of instances where they hold it people accountable, unless you're in fields like academia is one, pharma. I've seen that be a thing in the government agencies, very much so. They'd like to see like cover letters. So there's certain industries where you're going to see that be true, but from what I've seen, just generally speaking, I have not seen that to be the case. But again, that's just based on my, personal experience. But I will say that I have recruited a lot of about 35 different role profiles. So I've worked with a lot of different companies. And so that wasn't something that really came up, especially at Indeed. I worked with a lot of different companies and hired for their teams, and that was not something that was really a topic of discussion. The cover letter, like, it wasn't held against people. Okay, and then we have one more question here, which is Lawrence. So Lawrence, so with the previous job experiences, example, contract management, be in the early section you mentioned before. So yes, you can have an earlier career, and then you can have those job roles. And then because those job roles, I guess my question for you would be the freelance work that you're doing. How much freelancing are you doing? Is it like kind of hit or miss, or is it pretty steady, the freelancing work that you're doing right now? Lawrence? Okay, I'm gonna answer. Okay. So it's basically between writing and audio work. Okay, so if you're having a consistent and steady flow of freelance work, then I would emphasize that because that's going to be your most recent work, and then have the other experience in an earlier career section. And then you can have just a few bullet points there. So maybe like 3 or 4 bullet points for those roles. If you miss job postings as soon as they're posted, should you not apply if it's been 3 weeks? That's a good question. You're good, Lawrence. So Katie says, if you miss job postings as soon as they're posted, should you not apply if it's been 3 weeks since the job has been posted? So this is a great call out, and one that we didn't get into as much, but since you all are still here, I'll talk about it. So job postings, typically when it comes to recruiting, when we open a job role, the first 2 to 3 days are going to be like prime days for influx, meaning job applications coming in. Once a recruiter receives the number of job applications that they need, typically they're going to go through those initial applications that have come in. Then from there, they're normally shortlisting, and they're sending resumes over. They're either doing phone screens first and then sending it to the hiring manager, or they're passing some resumes along to the hiring manager for review and for feedback. So in your case, you're asking if a job has been posted and then it's been 3 weeks. So I would definitely go in kind of with the mindset of, if it's been 3 weeks, I wouldn't necessarily say don't apply, but I would say I right now would go in with the mindset of it's probably going to be more of a hit or miss, because they're probably at this stage going through the interview process. Unless, in some instances, companies will keep job roles open and they do kind of bring in a large number of applicants, and then they'll spend several weeks doing that, but that's not typically on average. Normally, they're opening the role with the intention of shortlisting and starting to go into interviews. So at the 3 week mark, normally at 3 to 4 weeks, you're already seeing that the interviews are taking place. So I would say if you're deciding should I apply or not, again, I would go back to more of the, if it's a role that I'm really excited about and I just want to shoot my shot, shoot your shot. I would say go for it rather than not, because if you don't go for it and maybe like they go through those interviews and none of those candidates work out, you don't want to miss your opportunity. But I would say, would that be my first reaction to like apply? Probably not. Like, I would prioritize roles that are open, that have been open within the past week, would be the priority that I would focus on. And if I'm trying to preserve my time and my bandwidth, then, if I have the bandwidth, then I would go further out if you see jobs that you're interested in. That's my lengthy answer, but I always like to give the why so everyone can understand. So, but yeah, it looks like we are done with questions here. So just want to wrap up really quick for y'all that are left here. I do have a free community. So feel free if you are interested in joining the free community. So there's a link in the email that you should have gotten the message for this training. So there's a paid version, but there's a free version. And I host weekly office hours in the free version. And then I have resources in there as well, where, there's some tools that you can use to help you with your job search. So if you want to be part of the community and you have not seen that in your inbox, I will send out the link. But I would love to, have you in the community, because I'm genuinely trying to help as many people as I can, because I do recognize fully it is a tough market out there. And I want to do my best to give back, to people and support where I can. So that's it. That's all I got. All right. Thank y'all. Yes, thank you. I hope you have a great day. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.